The clock had barely struck the hour when whispers began to leak out of Windsor's private walls. 2 minutes ago, behind polished oak doors, King Charles made a decision so brutal, so irreversible, that even those who had predicted years of royal turmoil could not believe it had finally happened. He stripped his own son, Prince Harry, of his royal title. A father cutting his child away from the one thing that tied him to the 1,000-year-old institution of monarchy. Imagine that. Imagine the silence in the room when a monarch, not just a father, looked his son in the eye and chose crown over blood. Why would a father do this? Why now, when the monarchy teeters under the weight of global skepticism? Could it be duty, spite, fear, or something far darker, something whispered in corridors but never spoken aloud? This is not just a story about a title. It is about betrayal, power, legacy, and the kind of pain only family can inflict. And that is why the world needs to understand what truly happened inside that private meeting. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the scene. The setting wasn't grand. It wasn't the kind of gilded ballroom the public imagines when thinking of royal decrees. No, this was a smaller, almost claustrophobic room where the weight of centuries pressed down on the walls. Thick curtains muffled the sounds of the outside world. A fireplace crackled, throwing shadows across faces both pale and tense. In that space, the monarchy was no longer a distant institution. It was a family in crisis, a family tearing itself apart. And here's the thing. This confrontation wasn't sudden. The seeds had been planted long ago, long before Meghan, long before Harry's decision to step away. To really grasp the shock of this moment, we must understand the deep cracks that have been widening for years, cracks that were papered over in public but whispered about in private. Harry had been labeled despair since birth. Always second, always overshadowed. He was the one destined to walk 2 steps behind, to smile while others reigned. Can you imagine growing up with the constant reminder that you were important, but never essential? Loved, but never quite enough? Now let's pause. Ask yourself, what would that do to a child? To be born into the grandest family on earth, only to be told, over and over, that your purpose is simply to support someone else's destiny. No matter what you achieve, no matter how you serve, you will never be the one at the center. How many of you would carry that quietly? Or would you, like Harry, eventually rebel? But this rebellion, this breakaway, came at a cost. For years, Harry tried to live in the shadow without bitterness. He served in Afghanistan. He built the Invictus Games. He took on causes that others ignored. But then came Meghan. To Harry, she was more than a wife. She was an escape, a chance at a new identity beyond despair. To the rest of the royal family, however, Meghan became the catalyst, the flame that set centuries of tension ablaze. And so the stage was set. Years of resentment. A new partner who dared to challenge tradition. And a monarchy trying desperately to appear untouchable while crumbling from within. The private meeting was inevitable. The only question was when. Now picture this moment. Charles, dressed not as the doting father but as the king, sat stiffly at the head of the table. William, silent but watchful, occupied his place to the right. Advisors lingered in the background, their faces tight with unease. And Harry? Harry was there, unyielding, his eyes fixed on the man who had just changed his life forever. There were no cameras, no speeches. Just a father's cold voice cutting through the heavy air. The words were simple, clinical almost, but their weight was devastating. You are no longer entitled to your royal title. Not shouted, not screamed, just delivered with the finality of a man choosing monarchy over his own bloodline. Let's not underestimate the cruelty here. Stripping a title isn't just about ceremony. It is an erasure. It is taking away the one symbol that tethered Harry to 1,000 years of history. Think about that. To the world, Harry will always be Diana's son. To his supporters, he will always be a prince. But to the institution of the monarchy, the very body his family controls, he is now officially an outsider. Why does this matter? Because in monarchy, symbolism is everything. Titles are not mere words. They are power, recognition, legitimacy. They are a shield and a weapon. To strip Harry of his title is to declare him an enemy of the crown, a man with no role, no protection, and no claim. What does that do to him? What does that do to Meghan? And perhaps most importantly, what does that do to the fragile image of a monarchy already drowning in scandal? Here's where things get darker. Those in the room report that Harry didn't flinch. No tears, no anger, just silence. A silence so heavy it shook everyone present. Because silence, in that moment, was more powerful than any outburst. It was as if Harry had been preparing for this all along, almost as if he expected it. But here's the contradiction. If Charles believed stripping Harry of his title would bring peace, he may have achieved the exact opposite. Instead of closing a chapter, he may have opened a wound that can never heal. Because now, Harry is untethered, and a man with nothing to lose can be far more dangerous than one bound by duty. Think about the timing. Why now? Charles has been king for barely a moment in historical terms, and already his reign is being defined by division. Is this his attempt to secure his legacy? To protect William? Or was it personal? A father lashing out against the son who walked away? And then comes the irony. The monarchy's strength has always been its ability to appear above human pettiness, to seem timeless, unshaken by ordinary emotions like jealousy or anger. Yet here we are, watching a king make a choice so deeply personal that it exposes the very humanity he is supposed to conceal. Isn't it fascinating how the crown, meant to symbolize unity, has become the very thing tearing them apart? Ask yourself, what happens when loyalty to the crown outweighs loyalty to blood? What happens when a father chooses duty over love? History is filled with examples of rulers sacrificing family for power, but each time, it leaves scars that echo for generations. Will this be Charles's legacy? The king who chose crown over son? And what about William? Sitting in silence, watching it all unfold. Did he agree with his father? Did he secretly welcome the removal of a rival? Or did he feel the sting of watching his brother erased from their shared destiny? Silence is never neutral. In that room, William's silence was an answer in itself. Now let's not forget Meghan. She wasn't there, but her presence was everywhere. Advisors whispered her name. Her influence loomed over every word. To many in the palace, this was less about Harry and more about her. Stripping Harry was, in their minds, a strike against Meghan. A message: you cannot rewrite tradition. But here's the twist. The more they tried to erase her influence, the more they solidified it. So here we are. A title stripped, a son cast aside, a monarchy once again exposed for its fragility. And yet, this is just the beginning. Because decisions like this don't end in that room. They ripple outward. Through the press, through politics, through history itself. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever wondered what silence feels like when it isn't peace, but war? That's exactly what hung in the air after King Charles uttered the words that stripped his son of his title. But here's the shocking twist. Charles didn't stop there. He leaned forward, his voice steady, and what he revealed next wasn't just about Harry. It was about the monarchy itself, the very institution that billions around the world still see as a symbol of tradition. And in that moment, the private family meeting became a battlefield where old wounds were ripped open. Picture it. Harry sat still, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on his father. The silence wasn't surrender, it was a weapon. But silence can't last forever. And soon, history itself came crashing into the room. Because this wasn't the first time a monarch had turned against his own blood. Far from it. The British monarchy has a dark history of betrayal within its own family. Brothers against brothers, fathers against sons, cousins plotting assassinations to secure the throne. Think of Edward VIII, who gave up the crown for Wallis Simpson, only to live the rest of his life exiled, humiliated, and watched. Think of Henry VIII, who destroyed anyone, including wives and children, who threatened his legacy. And now, Charles joins that infamous line. A king choosing crown over family. But let's ask the question that no one in that room dared to say out loud. Had Charles been planning this for years? Was this truly about Harry's actions? Or was it about control, about reasserting authority at a time when the monarchy feels weaker than ever? You see, Harry wasn't just the rebellious son. He was Diana's son. And Diana still haunts that family. Her name, her image, her memory. Every time Harry speaks, every time he fights back, the ghost of Diana stands beside him. And Charles knows this. Everyone in that room knows this. Stripping Harry of his title wasn't just an act of discipline. It was an attempt to silence Diana's shadow once and for all. Now think about the irony. For years, Harry had been accused of abandoning the royal family. The tabloids called him a traitor. The palace painted him as the rebel prince who walked away. But in that room, it wasn't Harry who walked away. It was Charles, the father, slamming the door shut. It wasn't exile chosen, it was exile forced. Doesn't that turn the entire narrative upside down? Let's pause here. Imagine you're Harry. What do you do? Do you fight? Do you beg? Or do you sit there and let silence speak louder than any argument? Ask yourself, if your own father took away your name, your place, your identity, how would you react? Because Harry didn't fight back. Not then. Not yet. He let the weight of Charles's words hang in the air like a guillotine. And that terrified everyone in the room more than any outburst could have. Why? Because a man who holds his fire in the moment of betrayal is a man plotting something bigger later. And then there was William. Watching. Waiting. Silent. His silence screamed louder than any accusation. Did he agree with his father? Was this a coordinated strike, father and heir united against despair? Or was William's silence a mask for doubt, for unease, for guilt? No one knows. But here's what we do know. Silence in the House of Windsor has never been accidental. Every pause, every glance, every withheld word is part of a carefully orchestrated performance. Now here's where the meeting takes a chilling turn. Because Charles didn't just announce the removal of Harry's title. He framed it as a necessity, as protection, as duty. He told the room, in words sharp as daggers, that Harry's behavior, his interviews, his memoir, his accusations had weakened the monarchy. He said the public no longer saw Harry as one of them, so the institution couldn't either. Duty demanded it. Can you imagine that? A father turning to his son and saying, "This isn't about love. This is about duty." And yet, the contradiction was glaring. Because wasn't the monarchy itself weakened not by Harry's words, but by the actions of the family? By scandals, cover-ups, and cold silences that made the world question whether the crown had any moral authority left? Charles wanted to blame Harry, but maybe Harry was just the mirror reflecting back what the monarchy wanted to hide. At this point, Harry leaned forward. Witnesses say he finally spoke, and his words weren't angry. They weren't defensive. They were calm, almost icy. He said, "If it's duty you care about, then you've already lost your crown." Can you hear that? The sting in those words? Because in that single sentence, Harry flipped the script. He wasn't the son begging for mercy. He was the accuser, calling his father's crown hollow. The room shifted. Advisors shuffled uncomfortably. William's eyes darted. And Charles? His face stiffened. He wasn't just a king anymore. He was a father being told by his son that his throne meant nothing. Now ask yourself, why does this matter to us? Because this isn't just royal drama. This is the human cost of power. This is the story of how duty can destroy love, how tradition can suffocate family. And it makes us wonder, if the crown demands this kind of sacrifice, is it worth wearing at all? But let's zoom out for a moment. Because this meeting wasn't happening in isolation. Outside those walls, the world was watching. The press had already begun circling like vultures, waiting for scraps of truth to leak. And within hours, the story would explode. But in that moment, it was still contained, still raw, still a secret between father, son, and brother. And that secrecy made it even more dangerous. Because the longer something is hidden, the bigger the explosion when it finally comes out. And when this story came out, it wasn't just about a title. It was about loyalty, betrayal, and a monarchy struggling to prove it still mattered in the 21st century. Here's the twist. As Charles delivered his decree, something unexpected happened. Harry didn't just take the blow. He made a move of his own. And it wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It was quiet, deliberate, and devastating. A move that would shake not only his father, but the entire institution of the crown. But what was it? That's where the story takes a turn no one saw coming. What was Harry's quiet, deliberate move? That's the question no one in that suffocating room dared to ask aloud. Yet every single person felt it. Because sometimes power isn't in shouting. Sometimes it's in the calm defiance that says, "You can take everything from me, but you can't break me." And here's where the history between father and son, the years of unspoken words, buried wounds, and Diana's ghost, crashed back into focus. Harry didn't storm out. He didn't scream. He didn't crumble. Instead, he reached into his jacket and slid a small, leather-bound folder across the table. Imagine the tension. The advisors leaning forward, William stiffening, Charles narrowing his eyes. Because in the monarchy, paper is more dangerous than a sword. Inside that folder? Proof. Evidence. Receipts. Not of crimes. Not yet. But of conversations, letters, whispers from the past that Harry had carried like a secret weapon. And in that moment, Charles realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about a title anymore. This was about legacy. About the truth Diana left behind. Let's rewind. Think of Harry's childhood. The world saw the photos. Diana holding his hand, shielding him from cameras, comforting him while Charles was absent. But what the public didn't see were the letters Diana left for her boys. Notes scribbled in the dead of night. Words of warning, of love, of prophecy. Harry kept some of them. And now, decades later, in the middle of this brutal family confrontation, he slid those words into the light. Pause and think about this. What could those letters possibly say? Could Diana have predicted the very moment when Charles would turn against Harry? Could she have written warnings about the monarchy's coldness, about the danger of silencing those who don't conform? Imagine Charles, sitting there as his late wife's words were placed before him like a ghostly witness. How do you fight the dead when the dead are right? Harry didn't read the letters aloud. That's what made it even more chilling. He didn't need to. The implication was clear. I have my mother's voice. I have her truth. And if you erase me, I can make sure the world hears her side, louder than ever before. Now, ask yourself, what's more powerful? A title given by a king? Or the voice of the most beloved woman in modern royal history, preserved by her own son? Which would the world rally behind? Which would history remember? The contradiction here is staggering. Charles wanted to strip Harry to protect the monarchy, but by doing so, he handed Harry the moral high ground. Suddenly, Harry wasn't the rebellious runaway prince anymore. He was the silent son, armed with his mother's memory, standing up against a crown that had already failed her. Doesn't that flip the entire narrative? Let's not underestimate the effect this had on William. Because while Charles's face hardened, William's eyes betrayed something else. Guilt? Fear? Maybe even admiration? After all, William had letters too. He had Diana's words. But he chose silence. Harry, on the other hand, chose to act. Did William wonder, in that moment, whether he had betrayed his mother's memory by staying quiet all these years? The air in that room turned heavy. Advisors shifted nervously, their pens scratching on notepads, knowing full well this wasn't just family drama. It was history in the making. And the cruel irony? This meeting, meant to contain Harry, had just unleashed something far bigger. Think about the contradiction. Charles, the king, thought he was cutting his son off. But instead, he gave him freedom. No more title, no more duty, no more leash. Harry could now move unchecked, untethered, armed with Diana's words and the world's sympathy. And Charles knew it. The look in his eyes gave him away. Here's a shocking twist. Some in the palace believed Charles feared not Harry himself, but Meghan's ability to amplify him. Harry with Diana's letters was dangerous enough. But Harry and Meghan, together, with a platform that reached millions across the globe, that was explosive. That was war. So, let me ask you, what do you think hurts more? Losing a crown you never wanted? Or gaining a weapon your enemies never thought you had? Harry walked into that room as the spare. He walked out as something far more powerful, a son who carried the unbreakable echo of his mother. And yet, just when it seemed Harry held the upper hand, Charles revealed something no one expected, something that shifted the ground beneath everyone present. Because while Harry had Diana's letters, Charles had his own secret. A secret promise made decades earlier, one that changed the meaning of this entire confrontation. But what was that secret? That's the part no one saw coming. What was that secret? What could a king possibly hold in reserve that would shake even his defiant son into silence? The room bristled with anticipation. Charles straightened in his chair, his face pale but determined. He looked not just at Harry, but at William too, as if reminding them both of something they had forgotten, or perhaps something they had never fully known. Then, in a voice that was steady but low, he said, "Your mother made me promise something before she died. And it was about you." Imagine the weight of those words. The late Diana, the woman who had been silenced by tragedy, suddenly resurrected through a promise that had been kept locked away for decades. What could it have been? A vow of protection? A warning? Or something darker, something that revealed a truth too volatile to ever be spoken publicly? The contradiction here was almost unbearable. Harry had placed Diana's letters on the table, believing he held the ultimate card. Yet Charles countered with something far more dangerous. Let's pause and ask, if you were in Harry's place, how would you react? Would you lean in, desperate to know what your father had kept from you all these years? Or would you recoil, fearing the truth might burn more than it healed? Here's the thing. Charles didn't elaborate right away. He let the silence fester. He let the tension gnaw at everyone present. Because sometimes power isn't in the revelation, it's in the delay, the suspense, the knowledge that what comes next could rewrite everything you thought you knew. And then Charles revealed it. Diana had begged him, before their marriage shattered completely, to protect their boys from the crown itself. Not from outsiders, not from the press, from the crown. She had feared, even then, that the institution would destroy them. She made Charles promise that, no matter what happened between them, he would ensure the monarchy's grip would not consume their sons. Do you see the irony? Diana's dying wish was not about keeping her sons inside the monarchy, but keeping them safe from it. And here was Charles, decades later, claiming that stripping Harry's title wasn't a punishment. It was the fulfillment of that promise. Can you feel the twist of that knife? But ask yourself this, was Charles telling the truth? Or was this a convenient manipulation, a way to mask cruelty with the illusion of love? If Diana really said those words, would she have meant banishment? Or was she begging for compassion, freedom, a softer touch? The meaning was ambiguous, and Charles used that ambiguity like a weapon. Harry's face darkened. Witnesses say he muttered something under his breath, barely audible, but sharp enough to sting. You twist even her memory. That's when the temperature in the room shifted again. Because accusing a father of betraying his dead wife's legacy isn't just family drama, it's nuclear. And William? He looked stricken. Because if Charles's claim was true, then William too had been protected by that promise all these years. Yet instead of rebelling, he had embraced the crown. Did that make him complicit in breaking their mother's wish? Or did it mean he had betrayed her by choosing the crown she feared? Imagine the guilt, the conflict, boiling beneath his silence. Let's zoom out here. This is where the contradictions pile up. Charles says he stripped Harry of his title to protect him. Yet protection feels like exile. He says it's what Diana wanted. Yet Diana's entire life was about shielding her boys from pain. He claims to be honoring her. Yet in doing so, he destroys the very bond she fought to preserve. Isn't it almost Shakespearean? A king using his dead wife's words to justify cutting off his son. But here's where it gets even more explosive. Because Harry didn't just sit back. He finally raised his voice. And his words were thunder. If that's true, then you broke that promise the day she died. You let the crown consume her. And now you're doing the same to me. Can you hear the echo in those words? The accusation wasn't just about the present. It was about history. About the night Diana died in Paris. About the unanswered questions, the suspicions that still haunt the public to this day. For Harry, this wasn't just about titles. It was about the crown's blood-stained past. Now pause. Think about the emotional stakes here. Father and son weren't arguing about semantics. They were ripping open the deepest wound in their family's history. Diana's death, the monarchy's role, the failures of the past being replayed in the present. How does a family survive that? How does an institution hold itself together when its very foundation is built on betrayal? Here's the contradiction the world will never stop questioning. Was Charles trying to protect his son or protect himself? By invoking Diana, was he honoring her or weaponizing her? These questions hung in the air like smoke, choking everyone in that room. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, something unexpected happened. William finally broke his silence. After sitting through the accusations, the revelations, the daggers disguised as words, he finally spoke. And what he said was not what anyone expected. What could William possibly say after all that silence? What words could shatter the fragile, unbearable tension of that room? He leaned forward, his face pale but his voice steady. And for the first time since the meeting began, the heir spoke not as the future king, but as a brother. Enough, he said. Just one word, sharp and cutting, slicing through the thick fog of accusation. But that single word carried centuries of weight. Enough of the silence. Enough of the lies. Enough of the twisting of Diana's memory. Can you picture it? The usually composed William, the one who plays the role of dutiful heir, suddenly taking a stand. Not against Harry, not against Meghan, but against the unbearable war between blood and crown. The contradiction was almost too much to process. The man who had benefited most from Harry's downfall was now the one calling for it to stop. But here's the twist. William's words weren't meant to defend Harry or Charles. They were meant to expose something far deeper. You both talk about promises, he said, but neither of you has kept them. Pause. Let that sink in. A brother accusing both father and brother in the same breath. William wasn't choosing sides. He was choosing truth. Think about it. Charles claimed he was honoring Diana's wish by stripping Harry of his title. Harry accused Charles of betraying her memory by weaponizing it. And now William turned the mirror on both of them. Neither of you has lived up to her legacy. Isn't that the cruelest irony? The one woman whose love could have united them was now the very reason they were tearing each other apart. And then William said something that froze the entire room. Mum warned me too. She told me this family would destroy us if we let it. And she was right. Can you imagine the shock? For years, William has been painted as the loyal son, the dutiful heir who never questioned the crown. And yet here he was, admitting that Diana had confided in him, too. Admitting that he, too, had heard her warnings. And the revelation didn't just change the dynamic, it shattered it. Let's pause and ask, what does this mean for William's image? If he knew Diana feared the crown, why did he embrace it? Why did he stay silent all these years? Was it ambition? Fear? Or was it the unbearable weight of duty drilled into him since birth? Doesn't that contradiction make his role even more tragic? The air in the room turned icy. Advisors avoided eye contact, scribbling notes with trembling hands. Because William's admission wasn't just personal, it was political. If Diana's words became public, they could unravel the very foundation of Charles's reign. Imagine the headlines. Future king admits Diana feared monarchy would destroy her sons. It would be catastrophic. Harry's eyes widened. For the first time in years, he saw his brother not as rival, not as enemy, but as ally. Briefly, just briefly. And Charles? His face drained of color. Because in that moment, he realized both his sons had inherited Diana's fire. And that fire was now aimed squarely at the crown. But William didn't stop there. He turned to Harry and said, "You claimed to fight for her memory. But leaving didn't honor her. It broke her wish for us to stand together. You abandoned me. You abandoned all of us." There it was. The contradiction. The brutal honesty. William wasn't defending the crown. He wasn't defending Charles. He was defending the brother he felt had walked away. The emotional punch landed hard. Because behind all the politics and betrayal, there was still something painfully human. Two brothers mourning the same mother in completely different ways. And here's where it gets even darker. Charles, trying to reassert control, slammed his hand on the table. Witnesses said the sound echoed like a gunshot. He snarled, "This isn't about Diana. This is about survival. And if you think I'll let her memory destroy this family, you're both fools." Do you hear the chilling admission in that line? Charles wasn't denying Diana's fears. He was confirming them. He admitted, in his anger, that her memory was a threat. Not to him as a father, to him as a king. And that one slip revealed more truth than he ever intended. So let's ask, when survival becomes more important than love, can a family even call itself a family anymore? Or is it simply an institution masquerading as blood? Harry stood, finally breaking his stillness. He looked at William. He looked at Charles. And in a voice steady but shaking with restrained fury, he said, "If you think stripping me of a title will silence me, you've learned nothing from what happened to Mom. And this time, the world will hear everything." Those words weren't just defiance. They were a declaration of war. Because now the stakes had shifted. This wasn't just about family. It wasn't just about Diana's ghost. It was about who would control the narrative of history itself. Would it be the crown, clinging to survival? Or would it be Harry, armed with his mother's truth and the freedom of exile? But before Harry could leave, before the meeting could end, Charles whispered something so shocking, so chilling, that even William flinched. And that whisper changes everything. What could a king possibly whisper that would make even his heir flinch? What secret could be so explosive, so deeply buried, that Charles dared not say it aloud, only breathe it in a voice meant for his son's ears alone? Charles leaned forward, his eyes locked on Harry, and muttered words that froze the room. The advisors stopped scribbling. William's face tightened. Harry's jaw clenched so hard it seemed his teeth might crack. No one outside that circle could fully hear what Charles said, but the impact was undeniable. So let's ask the question, what could Charles have revealed in that moment? Was it a confession? A threat? A truth Harry had long suspected, but never heard from his father's own lips? Here's one version whispered by palace insiders, that Charles suggested Diana's death wasn't the accident the public was led to believe. Not a full admission, not a clear explanation, but enough of a hint to terrify Harry, to remind him of the invisible power the crown still holds. Imagine the chill of hearing your father, the king, link your mother's death to forces beyond your control. Would you crumble? Would you rage? Or would you finally decide that silence is no longer an option? And here's the contradiction. If Charles whispered that to intimidate Harry, it backfired. Because instead of breaking him, it lit a fire. Harry's face turned crimson. His voice finally broke into raw fury. You dare use her name to scare me? He spat. You dare weaponize her death? This was no longer a meeting. This was war in real time. A father and son locked in battle, with the memory of Diana as both weapon and shield. William rose to his feet. For a moment, it looked like he might step between them, play peacemaker. But his words only deepened the fracture. Stop this, he said. If we let her death define us, none of us will survive this crown. But think about what that means. William was admitting, openly, that the crown itself is a threat. That Diana's death is still the fault line splitting them apart. Doesn't that change everything we thought we knew about his loyalty? The heir who always defended the monarchy was now admitting it was dangerous. The irony couldn't be sharper. The advisors were pale. One muttered under his breath, "This cannot leave this room." But that's the problem with secrets in the House of Windsor. They never stay hidden. Not for long. Let's pause and reflect. Why would Charles whisper instead of proclaim? Why would a king, used to commanding nations, lower his voice to barely more than a breath? Because whispers carry more weight than shouts. A whisper means danger. A whisper means this truth is too volatile to put on record. And in that silence, everyone in that room understood. If the world ever heard what Charles had just said, the monarchy itself could collapse. Harry's hands shook. For a moment, he looked like the little boy walking behind his mother's coffin, forced to grieve in front of the world while his family remained cold and distant. The wound was never healed. And now, Charles had torn it open again with one chilling line. Ask yourself, how does a son forgive a father who uses his dead mother as leverage? How does a brother trust a brother who stays silent while such words are spoken? And here's where the contradiction deepens. Charles claimed earlier that stripping Harry's title was to protect him. But this whisper, this shadowy allusion to Diana's death, revealed the opposite. It wasn't protection. It was fear. Fear of what Harry might say. Fear of what Harry might reveal. Fear that the ghost of Diana, still loved by millions, might rise again through her son's voice and destroy the monarchy from the inside. Harry stood slowly, his fists trembling at his sides. And then he said something that sent a chill through every spine in that room. If you think I'll be silent, you're wrong. If you think I'll let her memory die in your shadows, you've underestimated me. This isn't over. It wasn't just defiance. It was a promise. William looked between them, torn. His eyes glistened. Was it anger? Regret? Or fear of what his brother might unleash? For a brief second, the mask of the dutiful heir slipped, and the boy who once promised his mother he'd protect Harry was visible again. But just as quickly, the mask returned. Silence reclaimed him. Let's zoom out. This wasn't just a private family meeting anymore. This was history replaying itself. Think of Edward VIII and the abdication crisis. Think of the feuds that split royal bloodlines across centuries. The monarchy has always devoured its own. And now, before our very eyes, it was happening again. A king, an heir, and a spare, locked in a triangle of betrayal that could either secure or destroy the future of the crown. But here's the question we have to ask. Who really holds the power now? Charles, with his throne and authority? William, with his silence and his future crown? Or Harry, stripped of titles, but armed with his mother's truth and a global stage waiting for him to speak? Because here's the twist. Power doesn't always come from crowns or titles. Sometimes it comes from the willingness to burn it all down. And Harry, in that moment, looked like a man ready to light the match. He turned toward the door. Every eye followed him. Every breath in the room seemed to stop. And just as he placed his hand on the handle, Charles said one final thing, louder this time, so everyone could hear. Walk away, and you will never come back. Those words weren't just a command. They were a curse, a severing of bloodlines, a father disowning his son in the most brutal, public way possible. But Harry didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He opened the door, stepped through, and left the room in silence. And that silence? That was the sound of a monarchy unraveling. But what Harry did next, outside those locked doors, was something no one in that room could have predicted. What did Harry do the moment he stepped outside those locked doors? What action could possibly follow the most brutal severing of ties a father could deliver to his son? Here's the shocking part. Harry didn't storm off in anger. He didn't rush back to Meghan in tears. He didn't call his lawyers in a panic. He walked slowly, deliberately, down the hall of Windsor, past portraits of monarchs who had ruled with iron fists, past the ghostly silence of centuries, and he made a decision that would change everything. Because Harry realized something that day. By walking out stripped of his title, he was no longer bound by the invisible chains of the monarchy. He was free, and in freedom, there is power. But let's rewind. As he walked through the corridors, his mind flooded with memories. The very walls seemed to whisper his past back at him. He saw himself as a boy, running down those halls with William, giggling under the watchful eye of their nannies. He remembered Diana kneeling down to straighten his tie before a public appearance, her soft voice urging him to just be yourself. He remembered the day she was gone, and those same halls became prisons of grief. Now, decades later, those walls watched him again. But this time, he wasn't the scared boy. He was the man who had been cast out, the son who had just been erased. And here's the contradiction. Charles thought he had ended Harry's connection to the monarchy by stripping his title. But in reality, he had given Harry a story so powerful that no title could compete. The crown relies on secrecy, on silence. But Harry now had truth. And truth is louder than crowns. Ask yourself, what would you do in Harry's place? Would you fight to reclaim what was taken? Or would you turn exile into liberation and use your voice to wage war on an institution that silenced you? Harry made his choice, and it began with a single phone call. Witnesses say he stepped outside into the cold evening air, pulled his phone from his pocket, and dialed. Who did he call? Meghan? His team of lawyers? A journalist waiting for the scoop of a lifetime? The palace staff couldn't hear the words, but they saw his face. Calm, determined, almost frighteningly focused. That's when it hit them. Harry wasn't broken. He was planning. And that's where the real danger lay. A man who has nothing left to lose becomes unpredictable, dangerous, revolutionary. Harry had been silenced his whole life. Now, stripped of his title, he could speak louder than ever, and the world would listen. But here's the twist. The palace thought they had contained the scandal, that this meeting, brutal as it was, would remain locked behind gilded doors. But they underestimated two things: Harry's resolve and the hunger of the press. Because even as Harry made that call, whispers from inside the meeting began to leak. Advisors, staff, people who had heard enough to know this was history in the making. Within hours, headlines were already swirling. King Charles in secret showdown with Harry. Royal rift explodes behind closed doors. Think about it. The very act meant to protect the monarchy from scandal had ignited the biggest scandal of Charles's reign. Isn't that the cruelest irony? Harry returned to Meghan that night with a look she had seen before. The look of a soldier. Not the broken prince the press loved to portray, but a man on a mission. He told her what happened. He told her what Charles had said. He told her the curse, the banishment. And Meghan, instead of crumbling, simply nodded. Because she knew. She had always known this day would come. Together, they began to plan their counterattack. Now ask yourself, how does one fight a king? Not with armies. Not with soldiers. With stories. With truth. With the kind of revelations that no throne can withstand. Harry and Meghan had something the monarchy feared most: the ability to control their own narrative. To speak directly to millions without the palace's filter. And here's the contradiction again. Charles stripped Harry's title to silence him. But in doing so, he gave Harry the microphone of history. And Harry was ready to use it. But what would that counterattack look like? Was it another explosive interview? A documentary? A memoir sequel? Or something far more dangerous? Leaks of Diana's letters, the whispered secrets the crown had buried for decades? Because here's the truth. Harry didn't just walk out of that room as a disgraced prince. He walked out as a man carrying dynamite. And all it would take was one spark to blow the monarchy's carefully constructed image apart. And here's the question that hangs over it all. Did Charles know what he had unleashed? Did William? Did anyone in that room understand that by casting Harry out, they had created their greatest enemy, not in the press, not in politics, but within their own bloodline? Harry sat with Meghan that night, the weight of Diana's memory heavy between them. And he said 6 words that would define the battle to come. It's time they hear her voice. Meghan looked at him, her eyes steady, and replied, "Then let's make sure they do." That was the moment the war began. But how would they unleash Diana's voice? And what hidden truth inside those letters could shake the monarchy to its core? It's time they hear her voice. But what exactly was in those letters Diana left behind? What words could a mother have written decades ago that still carried enough weight to shake a monarchy in 2025? Harry sat at the edge of the bed that night, the folder still in his hand, the leather cover worn from years of being hidden away. Meghan watched him closely, not with pity, but with the kind of focus that comes from knowing history was about to pivot on a decision. Should they release them? Should they let the world hear what Diana had feared, what she had warned, what she had predicted? Let's ask ourselves, how much power can a dead woman's words really hold? The answer, more than crowns, more than titles, more than entire governments. Because Diana wasn't just a princess. She was a myth, a symbol of compassion, rebellion, and truth. And if her voice returned, it would not whisper. It would roar. Harry opened the first letter, his mother's handwriting instantly pulling him back to childhood. The curves of her words, the tenderness in her phrasing. But beneath the love, there was something else. Fear, clarity, almost prophecy. She had written about the loneliness she endured within the palace. She warned that the same loneliness would fall upon her sons if they weren't careful. And in one chilling line, she said, "They will try to break you to protect themselves." Stop for a second. Doesn't that sound like it was written for this very moment? A king stripping his son of his title, not out of love, not out of protection, but to preserve the image of the crown? And here's the contradiction. Charles claimed he was honoring Diana's wish by cutting Harry loose. Yet Diana's own words, preserved in Harry's hands, seemed to scream the opposite. She hadn't wanted her sons broken by the monarchy. She had wanted them freed from it. Harry closed his eyes as Meghan took the letter gently from his hands. "The world needs to see this," she whispered. But Harry hesitated. Because here's the twist. Diana's words weren't just warnings. They contained names. Mentions of people inside the palace who had plotted, manipulated, whispered in the shadows. Releasing those words wouldn't just expose Charles. It would ignite a firestorm that could consume everyone still wearing the crown. So Harry asked himself, was he ready to go that far? Was he ready to turn his mother's memory into a weapon? Or was keeping her words private the last act of love he could offer her? And that's where the emotional battle within Harry began. The contradiction tearing him apart. On one hand, silence meant protection. On the other, silence was complicity. Now ask yourself, what would you do? Would you guard your mother's words out of respect? Or would you unleash them on the very people who destroyed her? Meghan, ever strategic, leaned closer. Diana's voice doesn't belong to them anymore, she said. It belongs to the world, to the people who loved her, to the people who still cry when they see her face. That's when Harry realized keeping the letters hidden wasn't protecting Diana. It was protecting the crown, and he was done protecting them. So the planning began. Quietly, methodically. They couldn't just hand the letters to the press. That would be dismissed as tabloid fodder, twisted by the palace machine. They needed a platform, a stage big enough, powerful enough, to amplify Diana's words so loudly they could never be silenced again. Netflix? They'd already tried that road. Oprah? Too familiar. What they needed was something bolder, something unexpected. Harry thought back to his time as a soldier. If you want to win a war, he said, you don't go where the enemy expects you. You strike where they're weakest. And where was the monarchy weakest? Public opinion. the court of global opinion. The millions who still adored Diana, who saw her as the people's princess, who never forgave the crown for what happened to her. Imagine the impact. Diana's words, read aloud by her own son, broadcast to millions in her voice through Harry's. It would be the resurrection of a ghost the monarchy had spent decades trying to bury. But here's the contradiction. Releasing those letters could also backfire. The palace would fight back with everything it had: denials, counterattacks, smears. They would paint Harry as manipulative, Meghan as the instigator, and Diana's words as misunderstood. Would the world believe the crown, or the son of the woman they adored? And this is where William re-enters the story, because word of Harry's plan began to trickle back to the palace. William, still reeling from his father's decision, now faced a terrifying possibility that his brother would unleash their mother's words and drag him down with the rest. Remember, Diana had warned William too. And if those warnings became public, how would he explain why he had ignored them? Why he had embraced the very crown she feared? Can you see the trap William was in? If he supported Harry, he risked destroying the monarchy he was born to inherit. If he opposed Harry, he risked betraying their mother's memory. There was no way out without blood on his hands. And this, dear viewer, is where the stakes reached their highest point. Because now, for the first time since Diana's death, both her sons stood on the edge of a decision that could either fulfill her legacy or erase it forever. Harry closed the folder, his mind made up. "It's time," he said. Meghan nodded. But just as they began to map out the next steps, Harry's phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered, and the voice on the other end made his blood run cold. Whose voice could make Harry's blood run cold? Who could reach across oceans, pierce through the static of an unknown number, and shake him in a way even his father's curse could not? It wasn't Charles. It wasn't William. It wasn't one of the palace advisors. The voice was older, softer, yet sharp enough to slice through decades of silence. It was his grandmother's oldest confidant, one of the Queen's most trusted courtiers, a man who had served Elizabeth II until her final breath. A man Harry had not spoken to since leaving Britain. And what he said in that moment revealed something Harry could scarcely believe. "Your mother's letters are not the only thing left behind," the voice said. "There are tapes, and you need to hear them before you decide your next move." Tapes. The word alone hit like a thunderclap. We've all heard whispers over the years about Diana's private recordings. It was no secret that she confided in journalists, that she taped her thoughts, her fears, her confessions in the final years of her life. But here, for the first time, someone was confirming that more still existed. Recordings hidden from the public, recordings Harry himself had never heard. Ask yourself, what could be on those tapes? Words spoken in Diana's own voice, unfiltered, unedited, unspun by tabloids or palisades. A mother speaking from the grave, with truths too dangerous to publish while she lived. Imagine the power of that. Letters are one thing. Written words can be disputed, twisted. But her voice? Her voice would be undeniable. Harry's hand tightened around the phone. "Where are they?" he demanded. The man's answer was chilling. "Not where you think. Not in Britain. And not safe for long. If you truly want her voice to be heard, you must act quickly. Because others already know. Others already know." Pause here. Doesn't that sound like the kind of phrase that changes everything? It meant Harry wasn't the only one aware of this treasure trove. It meant there were others, maybe within the palace, maybe outside, who were moving to either protect those tapes or destroy them. Now let's consider the contradiction. Charles stripped Harry of his title to weaken him, to silence him. But what if, in trying to shut him out, he had accidentally pushed him closer to discovering the one weapon more powerful than any crown, Diana's own voice? Meghan leaned forward as Harry repeated the words to her. "Tapes," she whispered, her eyes widening. She knew instantly what that meant. This wasn't just about Diana anymore. This was about control of the narrative. This was about deciding whether the monarchy's version of history stood, or whether Diana herself would rise and tell it differently. So let's ask, if you were Harry, would you chase those tapes? Would you risk everything to bring your mother's voice to the world? Or would you fear what truths they might contain? Truths that could hurt not only the crown, but also yourself? Because here's the twist. Not all of Diana's confessions were flattering. She had spoken openly about her pain, yes, but also about her struggles, her mistakes, her anger. Releasing her words could vindicate her, but it could also expose vulnerabilities the monarchy would exploit. And yet, Harry knew one thing. Once you hear your mother's voice again, you cannot turn away. You cannot pretend you don't know. That night, Harry and Meghan began making calls of their own. Trusted allies, journalists who had been loyal, a few friends from Diana's old circle who still whispered her name with reverence. Slowly, a map began to emerge. The tapes were rumored to be in France. Paris, the city where she had died. Almost poetic, isn't it? The place of her end, now holding the key to her resurrection. But with poetry came danger. Because if Harry was moving toward the tapes, you can be sure the palace was too. Charles, William, and the courtiers knew that if Diana's voice emerged now, it could shatter what little authority the monarchy still clung to. For them, the tapes weren't history. They were dynamite. And so, while Harry and Meghan quietly prepared to make their move, forces in Britain began mobilizing to stop them. Here's the contradiction that keeps gnawing at us. Charles stripped Harry of his title in the name of duty. Yet duty, in his mind, meant silencing the very truth his late wife left behind. Isn't it fascinating how duty can mean loyalty to an institution, even when it betrays loyalty to love? Back in Montecito, the house was buzzing with quiet activity. Meghan worked her contacts. Harry paced the room, replaying the call in his head. He could almost hear Diana's voice again, the way she used to sing to him, the way she whispered comfort when the world seemed too harsh. And now, after decades of silence, he was being told that voice still existed. But before they could book a flight, before they could set their plan into motion, Harry's phone buzzed again. Another call, another unknown number. And this time, the voice on the other end wasn't offering help. It was delivering a warning. Harry froze. The room, alive with frantic planning only seconds before, went still. Meghan's eyes widened. Her lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't. Because there it was. A direct threat. Not veiled. Not subtle. A promise of destruction if Harry dared to chase his mother's voice. Let's pause here. Imagine being Harry. You've just been stripped of your title. You've been cursed by your father, abandoned by your brother, and now, just when you think you've found your mother's truth, you're told it could cost you your life. What would you do? Step back? Or step forward knowing the danger? Here's the contradiction. For years, Harry had been accused of chasing attention, of seeking the spotlight. And yet, the one thing he wanted most, the truth of his mother, was the one thing the world's most powerful forces wanted silenced. Isn't that ironic? The man accused of speaking too much now faced a choice that required speaking louder than ever, or not at all. Harry pressed the phone to his ear, his voice steady but seething. Who is this? The caller didn't answer. Instead, they said, "She left more behind than you realize. Some truths aren't meant to see daylight. Walk away, Harry, for your own good." And then the line went dead. Ask yourself, what would you think in that moment? Would you wonder if it was a bluff, a scare tactic? Or would you remember that your mother herself once feared forces moving in the shadows, forces she claimed were watching her, chasing her, long before the night of the crash? Harry lowered the phone slowly, his knuckles white. Meghan stepped closer. What did they say? He looked at her, his eyes dark. They said if we go after the tapes, we won't survive it. The silence that followed was deafening. Now let's step back and see the bigger picture. Harry and Meghan weren't just planning a press move. They were stepping into a game far older, far more dangerous. The monarchy has always been surrounded by invisible walls of protection, courtiers, MI5, even foreign allies. If Diana's tapes were real, they weren't just family secrets. They were state secrets. And state secrets are defended not by whispers, but by force. That's why the warning mattered. Because it wasn't just about Harry's reputation anymore. It was about survival. And yet, here's the twist. Warnings like that don't silence people. They provoke them. They tell them they're on the right path. Harry clenched his fists. If they're warning me, it means they're scared. And if they're scared, it means the truth is worth fighting for. But Meghan, ever cautious, raised the question Harry didn't want to face. What if the truth hurts more than it helps? What if those tapes don't vindicate her, but destroy everything she fought for? It's a fair question, isn't it? Diana was beloved, yes. But she was also human. Vulnerable. Flawed. Would hearing her unfiltered voice lift her higher in history, or bring her down? Harry shook his head. It doesn't matter. She deserves to be heard. She deserves her own voice, not their version of her. And so, despite the threat, despite the fear, the decision stood. They would go after the tapes. Here's where things take a darker turn. Because while Harry and Meghan prepared to move, the palace wasn't idle. Charles had ears everywhere. William, though silent in public, was briefed on every whisper. The monarchy had one goal: contain the fire before it spread. And if that meant intercepting Harry before he reached Paris, they were willing to do whatever it took. And so began the silent chase. Harry and Meghan, moving quietly, planning flights under false names, arranging security through trusted allies. And across the ocean, palace operatives moving just as fast, tightening nets, watching every movement. It was a race. A race not for money, not for titles, but for the voice of Diana herself. But before Harry and Meghan could leave, something happened that threw their plans into chaos. A package arrived at their Montecito home. No return address, just their names written in careful script. Inside, wrapped in plain brown paper, was a single cassette tape, and scrawled on the label, in Diana's unmistakable handwriting, were 3 words that sent chills down their spines. For my boys. What would you do if a voice you thought you'd never hear again suddenly returned? If a package arrived at your door containing not just an object, but a ghost, a piece of someone you lost decades ago? Harry's hands trembled as he held the cassette. Meghan's eyes darted between his face and the label, her lips forming the words but never quite saying them aloud. For my boys. It was Diana's handwriting. Not forged, not faked. Instantly recognizable, the same loops and swirls Harry had studied in birthday cards, in notes slipped under his pillow as a child. The same writing he'd once tried to copy as a boy, just to feel closer to her. And now here it was, in his home, 3 words meant for him and William. Pause and ask yourself, how does that feel? To lose someone so publicly, to mourn them in front of billions, and then decades later, to hold in your hand proof that they had left something for you that you'd never seen? Is it comfort, or is it torment? Harry's throat tightened. It's her, he whispered. It's really her. But Meghan didn't rush him. She didn't tell him to play it immediately. She simply placed her hand on his, grounding him, because she knew the power of what was inside. Once the tape was played, there would be no going back. Whatever Diana said would live in Harry's mind forever. And here's the contradiction. This was a gift, his mother's voice, preserved across time. But it was also a burden. Because what if her words revealed truths he wasn't ready to hear? What if her love came wrapped in warnings too heavy to carry? Harry placed the tape into an old player he had kept from his army days. The plastic clicked. The reels began to turn. And then, after decades of silence, the room filled with the unmistakable voice of Diana, Princess of Wales. My darlings, she began. If you are hearing this, then I was right to prepare for the worst. Meghan gasped softly. Harry closed his eyes, tears welling instantly. It was her. Not an interview. Not a news clip. Her voice, speaking directly to her sons. She continued, I have always feared that the crown will take more from you than it ever gives. They will ask for your loyalty, but they will not protect your hearts. You must remember, you are not just heirs to their tradition. You are my boys, and you are free to choose your own lives. Stop there. Doesn't that sound almost prophetic? As though she had seen, decades before, the very war Harry now found himself in. But then came the twist. William, you will carry their weight. They will depend on you. And Harry, my darling Harry, they will never forgive you for being different. You will suffer most. But you must never let them convince you that your worth lies in their titles. You are enough as you are. Harry's chest heaved. Meghan gripped his arm. Because there it was, the validation he had been craving his whole life. His mother telling him, from beyond the grave, that he was not defined by being the spare. That he was more than the title his father had just stripped away. And yet, Diana's voice wasn't done. There are things you will learn in time. Secrets they will try to bury. Some involve me. Some involve them. You must be careful. The truth is dangerous. But the truth is also freedom. If you are ever forced to choose between silence for survival or truth for freedom, remember what I told you. Choose freedom. Ask yourself, how do you walk away from words like that? Could you ignore them? Could you bury them? Or would you feel compelled to act, no matter the cost? Harry's tears finally spilled. Meghan pressed her forehead against his, whispering, she gave you permission. She gave you the path. But Diana's tape wasn't finished. In the last few minutes, her voice dropped to a near whisper. If this message ever reaches you, it means I was right to be afraid. And if I was right, then there are people who will stop at nothing to keep you from hearing the rest. The rest. Harry's heart pounded. The tape ended abruptly, the reels clicking as they spun into silence. Meghan reached to rewind, but Harry shook his head. No, he whispered. That's not the only one. There must be more. And here's where the contradiction cuts deepest. The tape was a lifeline, a mother's love reaching across decades. But it was also a breadcrumb, a clue that what Harry had was only a fragment of the whole truth. And fragments, as we know, are dangerous. They demand pursuit. They demand answers. Harry stared at the cassette in his hands, the words echoing in his head. There are people who will stop at nothing to keep you from hearing the rest. And then he realized, this wasn't just about finding his mother's voice anymore. It was about surviving long enough to hear all of it. Before the night ended, Harry made a vow. I'm going to find the rest, he said. Meghan's face hardened, her eyes fierce. Then we'll do it together. But even as they held each other, a shadow moved outside their Montecito home. Watching, waiting, because they weren't the only ones who knew where this was headed. And what came next would prove that Diana's warning was more real than Harry ever imagined. Weave in emotional beats, contradictions, and surprising twists. Use short, punchy lines for tension, longer ones for storytelling. Ask direct questions to the audience. What happens when you discover you're being watched in your own home? What happens when the walls that are supposed to protect you become the very windows through which unseen eyes observe your every move? That was the reality in Montecito. Harry had just made a vow to find the rest of Diana's tapes when a shadow flickered outside the glass. Meghan noticed it first. A quick movement, too deliberate to be the wind, too human to ignore. She froze. Harry followed her gaze, his body stiffening. They weren't alone. Now, imagine that moment. You've just heard your mother's voice from beyond the grave. You're shaken, vulnerable, and then you realize someone who shouldn't be there, is already listening, already watching. What do? Call the police? Confront them? Or pretend you didn't notice, knowing that acknowledging it might escalate the danger? Harry moved quietly toward the window. Nothing, just darkness. But the hairs on his arms told him the truth. Whoever was there didn't want to be seen. Meghan whispered, "We're being monitored." Her voice wasn't panicked. It was steady, controlled, because she knew. From the moment Diana's name resurfaced, she knew the crown, or those protecting it, would never let this unfold without interference. And here's the contradiction. Harry thought leaving Britain freed him from the palace's watch. But exile didn't mean safety. It meant vulnerability. In London, the monarchy kept him inside the system. In California, he was outside it, but still under their shadow. Freedom wasn't absence of control. It was a new kind of battlefield. Harry checked the locks. Meghan pulled the curtains shut. They tried to breathe, but in that silence, the weight of Diana's final warning returned. There are people who will stop at nothing to keep you from hearing the rest. Now ask yourself, who was out there? A journalist, hungry for a scoop? A fan, desperate for a glimpse? Or something darker, someone sent to ensure the truth never left those tapes? The next morning, Harry did what soldiers are trained to do. He ran reconnaissance. Neighbors mentioned seeing unfamiliar cars idling on the street. His security team found tire tracks where no one should have parked. And one camera, hidden near the gate, had been tampered with. Coincidence? Or confirmation? Harry didn't believe in coincidences anymore. That day, he and Meghan doubled their security. But more than that, they made a plan. If Diana's tapes were real, if they were scattered, hidden, hunted, then the only way forward was to go after them before others did. Paris. That was the whispered location. The city of Diana's final night. The irony wasn't lost on Harry. He hated Paris. He hated the memory of it. But now Paris held the key. Before leaving, Harry replayed the tape one more time. Her voice steadied him. Choose freedom, she had said. Those words weren't advice anymore. They were a command. So he packed. Meghan packed. Their team prepared private flights. Everything was done quietly, through trusted friends. No leaks. No headlines. At least, that's what they thought. But here's the twist. Before they could leave, William called. Yes, William. Harry stared at the phone, the name flashing across the screen. The brother who had sat in silence during their father's wrath. The brother who had broken his silence only to accuse Harry of abandonment. The brother who stood to lose everything if Diana's truth came out. Should he answer? Would you? Meghan urged caution. It could be a trap. He knows where you're going. But Harry answered, and the voice on the other end wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It was tired. Don't go to Paris, William said. Please. Not like this. Pause. Think about that. William wasn't commanding. He was pleading. Harry's jaw tightened. Why not? William hesitated. Because I've heard some of the tapes. And they're not what you think. Shock. Confusion. Betrayal. How had William heard them first? Why hadn't he told Harry? And more importantly, what did he mean not what you think? Harry's heart pounded. What do you mean? He demanded. William's voice broke. They'll destroy her. They'll destroy all of us. And just like that, the brothers were standing on opposite sides of the same truth. Harry believed the tapes would set Diana free. William feared they would ruin her legacy forever. Can you see the contradiction? Both sons claimed to honor their mother. Yet one was ready to expose her voice at any cost, while the other believed protection meant silence. Who was right? Who was betraying her? Or were they both? Harry's fury boiled over. She told me to choose freedom. And I will. William's final words before hanging up were haunting. Then you'll make her a weapon. And once you do, you can never put her down. Click. The line went dead. Harry stared at the phone. Meghan studied his face. And in that heavy silence, one thing was clear. Nothing about Paris would be simple. Not the journey. Not the tapes. Not the truth. And when Harry and Meghan finally boarded that plane, they weren't just flying to France. They were flying straight into a trap laid decades earlier. Because Paris didn't just hold Diana's voice. It held her secrets,